Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. In 2014, UNAIDS devised its fast-track strategy that denominated global targets around knowing HIV status, commencing treatment, and viral suppression. Now, these targets are quite interesting. They all prioritise biomedical procedures and service provision. They imagine a future that is in a linear relationship to now. And today they operate as the dominant framework for assessing local and global progress on HIV and AIDS. Now, at this time in 2014, the Fast Track made some attempt to capture what it called the societal and structural enablers of program effectiveness in these metrics. But where the testing and treatment targets were staged as ambitious but achievable, the social target, zero discrimination, meant to have been achieved by 2020, was ludicrous. It's difficult to know how to read this zero, an expression of moral principle, a nod to the unfathomability of social process, a glib joke made by social critics in Geneva to refuse the whole game of technocratic strategizing. Now, while this target has since been broken down into more granular, practicable measures, replete with equally outlandish targets, who cannot laugh at this zero and the joke it makes of whatever science purports to determine, control, and predict the social? So I want to take such laughter seriously to open up the problem these targets seek to address to new dimensions and ways of being felt. For while stigma emerges in this discourse as an index of impossibility and often circulates as a catch-all empty slogan, we know it references something of immense importance that conditions the very possibility of achieving the cascade targets and sustaining them effectively. Indeed, we could say that it is imminent to that achievement in an interactive relation rather than an independent locus or domain of action. These days, HIV stigma is often talked about as though it were an attribute of the virus, as though suppressing the virus might also suppress this thing. But viruses don't cause stigma. People and institutions and social norms do, in tandem with the lived impact of histories of disgust and social shaming. Perceptions of contagiousness are known to provoke stigmatizing responses, of course, across a number of different conditions, from cholera to Ebola to leprosy. Bodies recoil, people are shunned, physical or symbolic boundaries are drawn, people are segregated. But many conditions are stigmatized on bases other than contagiousness, such as mental health, so-called obesity, being a foreigner or a racialized minority. Infectivity is not all there is to the social life of stigma. In the case of HIV and AIDS, various forms of stigma precede the condition and compound it in distinctive ways. A common way of making sense of HIV infection is as a moral verdict on a person's sexual or behavioural character, God's punishment for one's failure to abide by sexual, social or moral norms. For those who are conscious that their behaviour diverges materially from sexual, social or bodily norms, subjecting oneself to this kind of moral verdict may be too unbearable to contemplate. Indeed, in some settings, just presenting for VCT is felt to be an admission of sexual promiscuity and moral turpitude, and is for this reason avoided. The latest Global AIDS update sets the planetary target dial at 85, 88, 92. About 6 million people living with HIV did not know their status in 2021, with significantly higher proportions among men, children, and revealingly members of key populations across almost every region, unaware of their status. In some regions, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the Asia Pacific, this figure is alarmingly low, people knowing their status. In Indonesia, only 66% of people living with HIV know their status, with much fewer proportions among men who have sex with men, transgender women, sex workers and drug users. Only a quarter of Indonesians living with HIV are receiving antiretroviral therapy, and viral load testing is scarcely accessed or available. In 2021, 26,000 people died of AIDS in our nearest neighbouring country. Alongside late diagnoses, I find estimates of the number of people who know their status especially significant for the problem space they open up about how possible it is to want to know this information and how possible it feels to have to manage such a designation in the thick of the social and material relations that make up a given place, life and location. Now, HIV testing is the bedrock not only of treatment working as prevention, but also PrEP initiation among those who test negative and might benefit. It is also the target that most countries lag behind on. But in fact, all of the cascade targets anticipate and presume extended engagement with medical services on those at risk being prepared to confront over and again the prospect of making themselves into or being made into not merely biopharmaceutical subjects, but subjects whose moral worth is periodically adjudicated by medicine, and often when feeling otherwise healthy. As the artwork produced by Chiron Liu for this event conveys so powerfully for the HIV Sciences Art event, in diverse contexts, each dose of antiretrovirals, each step of the treatment cascade may be laden with the affective residues of sexual and other forms of stigma, abjection, and legacies of shaming. While antiretroviral treatment extends the length of life with HIV and contains the virus, the life it promises to extend is bare life, life without political or moral value. One question that requires locally sensitive modes of attention is where, when, and for whom is such life constituted as a life worth living? How might the terms of social value be expanded and, where necessary, challenged? Of course, the social meanings of HIV tests are fluid. They take on different shapes in the hands of different actors. In some instances, HIV tests are markers of promiscuity or immorality. In others, they are diagnostic tools enabling access to treatment, social benefits, and a return to health. In still others, they may take the shape of a verdict on one's capacity to administer medication properly, of basic competence and personal self-organisation, irrespective of complicating circumstances such as social abjection, malaise, poverty, stress, housing instability, systematic neglect and demoralisation. Now, to become detectable in such terms can be humiliating, compounding wider impressions of personal failure in ways that provoke apprehension and avoidance. So how tests are done, how they come to matter, and what they are made to mean is therefore a focus of considerable importance. Stigma is best understood as social process. It moves about as new norms of responsible personhood emerge, even while longer-standing forms persist and endure. The shape and forms of stigma will always be specific to local settings, their social orders and historical legacies, as well as the changes that these local places are undergoing. And so will its material force and affective impact. Alongside the quantitative measures being developed to monitor stigma, I think we must understand the quality of stigma experiences, what norms they reference, what it is doing to people, how it intersects with other logics of social ordering, or revives longer histories of trauma, abjection, and exclusion, and how it differs depending on where people sit in social hierarchies. And this qualitative information on what stigma feels like in different locations really needs to be listened to by quantitative researchers, by health providers, by program developers, by data system engineers, because, you know, they will affect the effectiveness of all of those systems. Stigma tends to be strongest where people are seen as morally responsible for their circumstances. Blame and shame are its most debilitating devices. But if we turn to the social and anthropological literature, reviews have found that the most prominent and consistent feature of ARV provision worldwide is the accent placed on individual responsibility for HIV management. So I think perhaps the biggest challenge for social scientists will be navigating this double bind in diverse settings, socialising the deceptive simplicity of biomedical readings, demonstrating how wider collectivities are implicated in these outcomes. Alongside this, communicating how affected communities are actually affected in their different social situations will, I think, be critical for building local capacities and the collective courage to affect how medicine is done, how healthcare is delivered, and how social norms take hold of people and might be changed. Thank you.